Historic U.S. Supreme Court ruling, presidential immunity defined for the first time in American history. Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court of the United States has delivered one of the most significant constitutional rulings in the nation's history, fundamentally redefining the scope of presidential immunity from criminal prosecution. In a 6-3 decision, the court ruled that a former president has immunity from criminal prosecution for actions taken as part of official presidential duties, while making it clear that there is no immunity for unofficial or personal acts. This ruling marks the first time in more than 240 years of American constitutional history that the Supreme Court has directly answered the question of whether a president can be criminally prosecuted for actions taken while in office. The decision immediately reshapes the legal landscape for former President Donald Trump and permanently alters how future presidents will exercise power. The case that changed everything. The case, known as Trump v. United States, arose from federal criminal charges brought against former President Donald Trump following the 2020 presidential election. Prosecutors alleged that Trump engaged in efforts to overturn the election results and interfere with the peaceful transfer of power. Trump's legal team argued that a president cannot be prosecuted for actions taken while serving as president, even after leaving office. They claimed that allowing criminal prosecution would weaken the presidency, interfere with executive decision-making, and violate the Constitution's separation of powers. Lower courts rejected this argument, ruling that no person, including a former president, is above the law. Trump appealed, and the case eventually reached the Supreme Court, forcing the justices to address a question they had never ruled on before. The Supreme Court's decision. In a majority opinion written by Chief Justice Robert Seiles, the court held that presidential immunity exists, but it is limited. The court established 3 core principles. First, a president has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions that fall within the president's core constitutional authority. These are powers explicitly granted by the Constitution, such as commanding the military, appointing officials, or vetoing legislation. Second, a president is entitled to presumptive immunity for other official acts carried out as part of presidential duties. This means prosecutors may face a high legal burden if they attempt to bring charges based on these actions. Third, there is no immunity for unofficial acts. Actions taken in a personal capacity, as a political candidate, or for private benefit receive no protection and may be prosecuted like the actions of any ordinary citizen. This framework creates a sharp legal distinction that now governs how presidential conduct will be judged. Why the court ruled this way? Chief Justice Roberts explained that the presidency is a unique office that must be able to function without fear of constant criminal liability. The court emphasized that criminal prosecution of official presidential actions could distort decision-making, discourage bold leadership, and undermine the executive branch. The majority opinion stressed that the Constitution separates power among branches of government, and that courts must avoid intruding into areas reserved for executive authority. At the same time, the court rejected the idea of blanket immunity. The justices made clear that the presidency does not place someone above the law and does not shield personal or political conduct from accountability. The dissent, strong warning from liberal justices. The 3 dissenting justices, Justices Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Jackson Brown, strongly criticized the ruling. Justice Sotomayor warned that the decision risks placing the president above the law. She argued that granting criminal immunity for official acts could allow a president to abuse power without fear of consequences. The dissent emphasized that the Constitution was designed to prevent kings, not create them. According to the dissenters, the ruling weakens democratic safeguards and threatens the principle that no one is above the law. Justice Jackson added that the decision may make it harder to hold future presidents accountable for serious wrongdoing. How this affects Donald Trump. The ruling does not end the criminal cases against Donald Trump. Instead, it sends them back to lower courts to determine which alleged actions qualify as official and which do not. Judges now must examine each charge individually. Actions taken as part of governing may be protected, while actions related to campaigning, personal interests, or private conduct may proceed to trial. This process will involve detailed fact-finding hearings and legal arguments. While it may cause delays, it does not eliminate the possibility of prosecution. Legal analysts agree that the focus of Trump's cases now shifts from procedural immunity arguments to factual questions. Prosecutors must show that the conduct in question was unofficial. Defense attorneys will argue that actions were tied to presidential responsibilities. This makes evidence more important than ever. Once courts decide which acts are protected, remaining charges can move forward normally. What counts as an official act? The Supreme Court did not provide a precise checklist for determining official acts. Instead, it instructed lower courts to consider the nature, context, and constitutional basis of the action. Motivation alone does not determine whether an act is official. Courts must look at whether the action falls within presidential authority, not whether it was done with good or bad intent. This means judges will play a major role in shaping how the ruling is applied. No ruling on self-pardons. The Supreme Court did not rule on whether a president can pardon himself. That question remains unresolved at the Supreme Court level. However, many legal scholars argue that self-pardons are unconstitutional because a pardon is an act of mercy from one person to another, not oneself. The issue may be addressed in future cases if it becomes legally relevant. Why this is a historic moment. This ruling represents a turning point in American constitutional law. For more than 2 centuries, the United States relied on tradition and assumption rather than clear legal rules when it came to presidential accountability. Now, for the first time, there is a formal legal framework defining when a president is protected and when a president can be prosecuted. Impact on future presidents. Future presidents will operate under this new reality. Every major decision may be examined later in court once they leave office. Supporters of the ruling say it protects strong leadership and prevents political retaliation through prosecutions. Critics warn it may encourage abuse of power by shielding official misconduct. Either way, the presidency has changed permanently. Comparison to history and other countries. In American history, former presidents have rarely faced criminal prosecution. After the Watergate scandal, President Nixon was pardoned by his successor, George Ford, before any trial could occur. In contrast, other democracies routinely prosecute former leaders. Countries such as South Korea and France have tried and imprisoned former presidents. The U.S. has now moved closer to international norms of post-office accountability. What happens next? Lower courts will now apply the Supreme Court's ruling to ongoing cases. This will involve hearings, legal briefs, and possible appeals. Once courts determine which acts are protected and which are not, trials may proceed more quickly. The bigger picture. This decision establishes that the president is not above the law, but also not an ordinary citizen while in office. It balances executive power with accountability in a way the Supreme Court believes is consistent with the Constitution. The long-term consequences will unfold over years as courts, politicians, and presidents adapt to this new legal reality. Conclusion. The Supreme Court's ruling on presidential immunity marks a new era in American governance. For the first time, the nation has a clear legal standard defining the limits of presidential protection from criminal prosecution. The decision reshapes Donald Trump's legal future, redefines the presidency, and sends a powerful message. Power comes with responsibility, and accountability ultimately follows office. American constitutional law has entered a new chapter, one that will shape the presidency for generations to come. What the Supreme Court ruling really means for American democracy and the future of the presidency. As the immediate legal impact of the Supreme Court's presidential immunity ruling begins to unfold, its broader consequences for American democracy are only starting to become clear. While much of the public focus has been on how the decision affects Donald Trump, legal scholars warn that the true significance of this ruling extends far beyond a single individual. This decision reshapes the balance of power between the presidency, the courts, and the rule of law itself. The shift from procedure to proof. For years, debates surrounding presidential accountability centered on procedural barriers. Could a president be charged? Could a trial occur while a president was in office? Could immunity block prosecution altogether? The Supreme Court's ruling dramatically changes that conversation. The legal battlefield now shifts from whether prosecution is allowed to whether prosecutors can prove that specific actions were unofficial. This places evidence, testimony, and factual records at the center of future trials involving presidents. Legal experts describe this as a turning point. Procedural shields that once delayed or blocked cases have been narrowed. What matters most now is what actually happened and why. This change could accelerate trials once immunity questions are resolved, making factual evidence far more decisive than legal technicalities. Why lower courts now hold enormous power. One of the most important consequences of the ruling is the authority it gives to trial judges. Because the Supreme Court did not define an exact formula for determining official versus unofficial acts, lower courts must now interpret and apply the ruling case by case. Judges will examine emails, phone calls, meetings, and documents. They will evaluate whether actions were tied to governing responsibilities or personal and political interests. This process could take time, but it also ensures that immunity decisions are grounded in facts rather than blanket assumptions. In effect, trial courts become the gatekeepers of presidential accountability. The impeachment question and criminal liability. Although the Supreme Court focused on criminal prosecution, the ruling indirectly reinforces the role of impeachment. The Constitution allows Congress to impeach and remove a president for serious misconduct. Once removed, or once a term ends, the individual no longer holds presidential power. This ruling confirms that leaving office does not erase criminal exposure for unofficial acts. In other words, impeachment is not the final step. Criminal accountability may follow. This creates a clearer accountability chain: misconduct, investigation, possible impeachment, and potential prosecution after office. Many constitutional scholars argue this structure strengthens democratic oversight rather than weakens it. No president above the law, but not below it either. The Supreme Court carefully balanced two competing principles. On one hand, the court reaffirmed that the president is not above the law. Personal wrongdoing, campaign-related conduct, and private acts can still lead to criminal prosecution. On the other hand, the court rejected the idea that a president should be treated exactly like any other citizen while performing official duties. The ruling recognizes the unique responsibilities of the presidency and the risks of criminalizing political decision-making. This balance is controversial, but it reflects the court's effort to preserve both accountability and effective governance. Political reactions across the spectrum. The ruling triggered immediate political reactions. Supporters of Donald Trump praised the decision as a victory for constitutional order and executive independence. They argue that without immunity, presidents would constantly face politically motivated prosecutions after leaving office. Critics, including many Democratic leaders and civil rights groups, condemned the ruling. They argue it weakens safeguards against abuse of power and opens the door to unchecked executive misconduct. Some political analysts warn that the decision could deepen polarization as legal accountability becomes entangled with partisan conflict. International perspective. Globally, the ruling places the United States closer to international norms, but with important differences. In many democracies, former leaders face prosecution after leaving office. South Korea, Israel, France, and Brazil have all put former heads of state on trial. However, those countries generally do not grant broad immunity for official acts. The U.S. ruling creates a uniquely American framework, blending immunity with post-office accountability in a way shaped by constitutional separation of powers. Foreign governments and legal scholars are watching closely. International observers are closely monitoring how American courts apply this ruling. The credibility of U.S. democracy has long rested on the idea that no one is above the law. How consistently and fairly this framework is applied will influence global perceptions of American governance. Legal scholars worldwide see this ruling as a test case for balancing strong executive authority with democratic accountability. How this affects future presidential decision-making. Future presidents will likely govern with this ruling in mind. Some experts believe presidents will become more cautious, carefully documenting decisions to establish that actions were official. Others fear the opposite, that immunity for official acts may embolden presidents to push legal boundaries, confident that criminal prosecution will be difficult. The true effect may lie somewhere in between. Presidents may rely more heavily on legal counsel and formal procedures to ensure actions remain within constitutional authority. The role of Congress going forward. Congress may respond to the ruling by strengthening oversight mechanisms. Lawmakers could expand investigative powers, clarify statutory limits on presidential authority, or reinforce ethics laws. However, Congress cannot override the Constitution, and any legislative response must respect the Supreme Court's interpretation. This places renewed importance on elections, oversight hearings, and impeachment as tools of accountability. The media and public responsibility. The ruling also places greater responsibility on journalists and the public. Because legal accountability may take years, transparency and investigative reporting become even more important. Voters must evaluate presidential conduct in real time, knowing that some consequences may only arrive after a presidency ends. Public understanding of the difference between official and unofficial conduct will play a key role in democratic accountability. What happens next in Trump's cases? In practical terms, lower courts will now conduct hearings to determine which actions alleged in Trump's indictments qualify as official. Some charges may be dismissed. Others may proceed to trial. Appeals are likely, and the legal process could stretch well into the future. While the ruling doesn't guarantee conviction or acquittal, it ensures that courts, not politics alone, will decide the outcome. A turning point in constitutional law. Legal historians describe this decision as one of the most important executive power rulings since Watergate. For decades, presidential immunity existed mostly as an assumption rather than a defined doctrine. Now, for the first time, there is a clear constitutional framework governing criminal accountability for presidents. This clarity comes with controversy, but it also ends decades of legal uncertainty. Final thoughts. The Supreme Court's presidential immunity ruling does not resolve every question. Instead, it sets the rules for how those questions will be answered. It limits immunity, rejects absolute protection, and preserves the possibility of prosecution while still protecting the presidency from excessive legal interference. The long-term impact will depend on how responsibly future presidents act, how carefully courts apply the standard, and how engaged the public remains. One thing is certain: the presidency, the courts, and American democracy itself have entered a new era. This ruling will shape elections, legal strategy, executive power, and accountability for generations to come.